And Vincent is our guide. So go ahead, Vincent.
Okay, so I'm doing bell hooks, eating, the other, desire, and resistance. And my three main topics that I wanted to look at was, of course, the other. So I'm doing the sexualized primitive other, the commodified other, and the consumption of blackness. So first, I was going to start with the sexualized primitive other, and I was kind of just like, what is primitive here? So I just looked at the Google definition, and the first one would be relating to, denoting, or preserving the character of an early stage in the evolutionary or historical development of something. And the second would be having a quality or style that offers an extremely basic level of comfort, convenience, or efficiency. So I felt like if those were kind of helpful for myself going in, looking at what the primitive other could be. And starting off with the sexualized other, Hooks talks about how the other in this situation is considered an object of desire, but not for who they are, it's for what they signify. On page 367, she says, and this is like the main part for the sexualized other, she talks about, so the British slang for, contemporary working British slang playfully converges the discourse of desire, sexuality, and the other, evoking the phrase of a bit of the other as a way of speaking about sexual encounter, fucking the other. Displacing the notion of otherness from race, ethnicity, skin color, the body emerges as a site of contestation, and sexuality is the metaphoric other that threatens to take over, consume, transform via the experience of pleasure. Desired and sought after, the sexual pleasure alters the consenting subject, deconstructing notions of will, control, coercive domination. So in this situation, the other, or fucking the other, is a form of reinforcing the dominant social, racial, sexual status quo. The other is desired by the promised transformation that is given to those in the dominant position through having these relationships with the other. And so the other in this situation is not especially considered, I guess, like a person. They're more of like a promise of transformation. It's similar to the idea of the ship where it's promised to take you from one place to another. So being with this other is more of an act than it is more of an act of self-transformation focused on the self, or in this case, the dominant population would be a white, straight male in this case. And she references this later, talking about on 368, talking about walking behind these young male students, talking to their buddies, where they would leave the world of innocence and enter the world of experience. And to do this, they wanted to hook up with non-white female students, and which they believed would change them. So the direct objective was not simply to sexually possess the other, it was to be changed in some way by the encounter. Naturally, the presence of the other, the body of the other, was seen as existing to serve the ends of the white male desires. So in this case, they wanted to instill a form of this status quo, like there is still maintaining of the status quo, but it's kind of changed. So instead of dominating, it's through desiring, right? So they replace the domination with sexual desire, and they talk about the other acts of how the other acts as a third party to the reformation of white identity, serving both as a physical catalyst to this transgression of social boundaries and as a disembodied witness. On 368 again, she talks about Picasso, who mentions his tribal objects as witnesses as opposed to models. They call upon the other to be both witness and participant in this transformation. So they're participating in it, but they're not a subject. They are the witness to this transformation of self of these white male figures. And in doing this, it allows for a transgression of boundary and a sense of being outside the historically socially acceptable status quo for the of normative whiteness. So this boundary is transgressed not in a way of force, because now it's not a thing that you could do. It is done through I guess, a replaced way in the sexual relation, and then, so they feel exempt from the perpetuation of racism through openly expressed desire for the other. And so this is like a reenactment of the imperialist colonial tactics, but through using this new tactic of desire, it comes without the guilt and the historical burden that is carried with it. So instead of saying that the other was subjugated through force, they say that the other was seduced. And yeah, so in this pleasure that they gain through being with the other, it acts as a form of release of guilt of the past, where these subjugated figures, instead of being forced upon them, they are seduced by these white men, and it releases the guilt of that past. And the primitive other is used as a return to oneself. So I think in this case, the primitive, right, like a regression to a past historical moment, it's a returning to oneself, or they act more as like a mirror. On 372, the desire is recontextualizes the whiteness in a new, the other in this case would be talking about the magazine Tweed, where they went to Egypt, right? And this is still a form of using the bodies of the other. However, in this case, it's not entirely sexual. So in this Tweed magazine, there are photos, like they go around the world taking photos. And interestingly, when they're outside of like a white setting, it's always a photo with the other people. And it's not because they're documenting these others who are different from them, it's because they're using them as a mirror for themselves. So she quotes here from Gustave Flaubert. She says, "We did not want our journey to be filled with snapshots of an antique land. Instead, we wanted to rediscover our clothing in the context of a different culture. Was it possible, we wondered, to express our style in an unaccustomed way, surrounded by Egyptian colors, Egyptian textures, even bathed in an ancient Egyptian light?" So that would be the recontextualization of whiteness in a different setting, where the whiteness is the other. So they don't want to see like this other culture, it's the desire to view oneself in a different place, in a new way, so they can return with like a new fervor for it. So the other is projected onto, and they're used to feel more comfortable with one's own whiteness by experiencing the other's sense. And when they return home, they feel this new sense of belonging to their dominant culture. And for example, she uses this one photo of a white woman standing next to an Egyptian woman. And the Egyptian, all the photos of the people they take there are captioned, right? Like you have to explain what is happening, because you're the outsider in that situation, or I guess if you were part of the dominant group, you'd be the outsider situation. And 372, visually the image suggests that she, the white woman, the Egyptian woman, and the first world white woman, like her, are liberated, have greater sense to roam than the darker woman who lives in a peripatetic lifestyle. And when they return to same magazine in Tweeds, the Standard, or back to Norway, it is, she says, like the white folks from this country are as at home in Norway as they are anywhere else, because they're not united by the culture that is similar, they're united by their whiteness, which is what they have in common. So that would be like the use of both sexualizing or even just like using the physical body of the other as a tool to reflect back on oneself. And in doing that, it's not really an appreciation of said culture, it's more of an appreciation of one's own culture once it's been taken out of its typical context. And then next would be the commodified other. So this would be the other being used in a commercial context. And she mentions here like cultural appropriation as an example. So the taking of a different culture and using it for one's own. On 369, so she says, in mass culture, imperial society takes the form of reenacting in re-ritualizing in different ways imperial colonizing journeys, a narrative fantasy of power and desire, the section of the other. No, wait, hold on. Here we go. The temporary crisis of identity in the West, especially as experienced by white youth, or eased by the primitive, is recouped via a focus on diversity and pluralism, which suggests the other can provide life-sustaining alternatives. Concurrently, diverse/ethnic racial groups can also embrace a sense of specialness that histories and experience have once seen as worthy only of disdain, can be looked upon with awe. So this is turning that difference or that otherness or that strange culture that you don't really recognize into something that you can use to be marketed, and it gives a promise of a new sense of identity for oneself. And I think an example of this would be on 376, where black art, for example, is decontextualized from the black artists and subsumated into the dominant culture and used as kind of a form, but it's been disembodied from the people who have originated it. The other's cultural contributions are utilized independent of the people who had made it. And here on 376, she says, the commercial nexus exploits the culture's desire expressed by whites and blacks to inscribe blackness as a primitive sign as wildness, and with it the suggestion that black people have secret access to intense pleasure, particularly pleasures of the body. It is the young black male body that is seen as epitomizing this promise of wildness, of unlimited physical prowess and unbridled eroticism. And so in this, like black masculinity is being sold as kind of like this idea or as this concept that can be embodied, which you would see a lot in, for example, I think she also mentions it, like in rap music, for example, where you would see a lot of, I would say, cultural appropriation of like black cultural signifiers being used in like white rappers' music, for example. And lower in the page, when young black men acquire powerful public voice and the presence via cultural production, as has happened with the exploitation of rap music, it does not mean that they have a vehicle that will enable them to articulate that pain. Providing narratives that are mainly about power and pleasure, that advocate for resistance of racism, yet phallocentrism, rap denies this pain. And so, so in this situation, she also talks about, interestingly, how people can buy into their own commodification. So this would be the commodification of black culture in rap music, and it becomes a way for particularly in this situation, she says like rap is a male thing. It's a male creativity expressed in rap and dancing, and it requires wide open spaces, symbolic frontiers where the body could do its thing, expand, grow, and move, surrounded by a watching crowd. So I think that this is kind of a form of masculine autonomous expression for these people who have been sold this themselves essentially, or this idea of themselves as a commodity. But however, what comes with it is that she says like it's also full of, as a result, much rap music is riddled with sexism and misogyny because they're being sold this idea of what it means to be this black man or this tough, primitive or like very masculine black man, but with that comes issues like sexism and misogyny in that space. Move on, because I have a lot of time. And then the consumption of blackness. So this is like the literal subsumation of black culture into the dominant culture. And this is typically represented with like, almost like literally eating of it. And here she mentions the movie on 374, Heart Condition. So essentially in this movie, it's a racist cop who gets a heart transplant from a black man, and then he, I guess, ends racism in himself. Great. And so the film offers a version of racial pluralism that challenges racism by suggesting that a white male's life will be richer, more pleasurable if he accepts diversity. Yet it also offers a model of change that still leaves the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy intact. Though no longer based on the coercive domination of black people, it insists that white male desire must be sustained by the labor, in this case the heart of the dark other. And so she mentions like this young, desirable, handsome, intelligent black male who was hung like a Shetland pony must die so that the aging white male can both restore his potency and from the transplant and be more sensitive and loving. So in this case, he literally takes the heart of this black man and has it in himself, and I think it can be seen as like a metaphor for like literally erasing the physical body of blackness. So it takes like the heart or like the lovingness or the caringness or the culture and the identity of it, and you take it into yourself, but then you completely excise it from the black body in the situation. And she also talks about that in the situation of political movements as well, like resurgence of black nationalism as an expression of black people's desire to guard against white cultural appropriation, a fantasy of otherness that reduces, but then it becomes a fantasy of otherness that reduces protest to spectacles and stimulates even greater longing for the primitive. Given this cultural context, black nationalism is more a gesture of powerlessness than a sign of critical resistance. So in this case, it would be the removal of like a black central figure or like of a black voice from this movement, and then it just becomes kind of like a hollow movement or a facade of resistance, kind of like when people like posted black squares on their Instagram during BLM. It's very that. So
just to give you, you should be about time, so.
Okay, perfect. And then anyways, so the use of black art is seen as something that's transgressive. They take the blackness from the art form to have that transgressiveness or that like, that virility or that life that is promised in that quote unquote strange otherness that is seen as very different, and it's seen as something that is fighting the status quo, but by removing the people who had created that art from it, it takes away their authority and the original political intent of it, and then it simply becomes a performative transgressiveness. And so Hook's article claims to critically examine the notions of interacting with the other, though they hold potential for positive change, is essential to remain critical of the way in which otherness is subsumed into dominant culture's identity, thereby erasing the identity of those from whom it originates. Okay, and now my questions.
Okay.
I think I kind of wrapped that up. Yeah, so, but pretty much in this article, it talks about the hybridity of culture and interactions with other cultures, but it's discussing a wariness to the oblivion of the actual originators of otherness, because like you take too much otherness into yourself and then you say, well, I'm the other, but then it sidelines the true people who are othered. So anyways, my questions. Is the term primitive entirely a pejorative, or can be reclaimed in the context of some other people's cultural practices or contexts? And hybridity, creolization, or melting pot amalgamation? How do we / can we prevent the erasing of the other's identity in the process of cultural exchange? And lastly, in the recognition, does the recognition of the other, wait, what? In the recognition of the other, does it allow for interchange of cultural values, or does it promote separatism?
Okay, great. All right, thank you, Vincent. All right, very good. Yeah, all right, well done. And lots to think about. And I just kind of want to stay somewhat on pace here, knowing that there's a few other readings, so I won't do a long recap of anything. I think you did a really great job here. In fact, I do think it'd be great to take up at least that, probably the hardest, most difficult question we might ask about, which is that how do we prevent erasing each other in cultural exchange question. And that is not an easy one to answer. I mean, and Bell Hooks sort of stages it here and there for us. She does say at the very end, for example, that she says at the very end, 380, when I began thinking and doing research for this piece, I talked to folks from various locations about whether they thought the focus on race, otherness, and difference from mass culture was challenging racism. So is pop culture challenging racism? There was an overall agreement that the message that acknowledgement of expression of racial difference can be pleasurable, and that represents a breakthrough, challenge white supremacy to various systems of domination. The overriding fear is that cultural, ethnic, and racial difference will be continually commodified and offered up as new dishes to enhance the white palate. The other will be eaten, consumed, and forgotten. After weeks of debating with students, she found the students were convinced something radical was happening and the issues were coming out in the open within a context where desire for contact with those who are different or deemed other as not considered bad, politically incorrect, or wrong-minded, we can begin to conceptualize and identify ways that desire informs our political choices and affiliations. Acknowledging the ways the desire for pleasure, and that includes erotic longings, informs our politics, our understanding of difference, and we know better how desire erupts, subverts, and makes resistance possible. We cannot, however, accept these new images uncritically. So, using that quote and following on what you're asking, Vincent, let's as a group just talk about it a little bit. Does it all, so maybe just more specifically, does Hooks end on a note of what exactly? I want to ask you, especially since the last reading in our thing is this theorizing of feelings and affect. Like, we could say that theory has affects tied to it. What's the affect that she's landing on? If majority of this is pretty, let's say, unhappy affect of how the other keeps getting consumed and so that the white sort of can spice up the life, but then just go back to being in control. Where does the essay end affectively about this idea of cultural exchange? That'll be the way I'll ask the question. Marvin, so you're our guide.
It feels like, I don't think she's entirely against the idea of cultural exchange, but it feels very cautious.
Yeah.
It's kind of like taking into consideration, I think, mostly like the consent of the other, and also the positionality of the person who is asking to take part in these practices, I think.
Yeah.
And so I don't think she's entirely against it. But
she definitely wants to find a sense of hope at the end, for sure. Yeah.
I feel like this is like a warning. It's like, look out for this.
Yeah.
Appreciation versus appropriation.
Yeah. Very good. Well said. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think also there's a point at which she talks about how, critiques of essentialism have not been turned on the white identity, and I think the ending note of this kind of relates back to that in the sense that all of the appropriations, cultural context, contact problem, a lot of it comes down to both essentialism and critiques of essentialism, and racial essentialism, and arguing that you kind of have to also turn that critique on white essentialism, then opens up, I think, space in her mind for
I think that's right. Yeah. I'll add those slightly just to complexify it. I think she's saying the same thing about black essentialism too, though. So let's say, we have this narrative where we say, try to liberate your desire. Try to be your desire and just follow it and find pleasure. Well, the problem is that that's actually been commodified and and racialized, and it's a way of actually dominating otherness. But on the other hand, it's still can actually have a transformative potential where you do connect with other people, and desiring can be a good way, but white desire needs to be criticized, and black desire too, because if black desire says that show called Living Color, which I used to watch when I was a kid, do what you want to do. Is it just feeding into the stereotype of black desire, that it's wild, it's primitive, it's masculinized, because there were girls dancing on the stage as they were singing that for the black sort of male gaze, and that's just reproducing more commodification essentially, and it's not actually criticizing, but it's saying it should be a good thing to have black desire, but you have to be self-critical too about that. So it's a very interesting ending point where actually desire is something we will need to theorize and theorize with and sort of recapture, or it's not the right exactly word, but inhabit. Theory requires some sense of desire. We went all the way back to what we called theory itself was libidinally charged. It sort of had the desire built into it. It also talked about desire, and then we talked about how Freud and then feminism and queer theory are showing how desire is in the narrative structure, in the history of novels and poems, and in the history of coming to in the history of what we call otherness and critique and you name it and so on. And Bell Hooks is picking all that up and saying even at the everyday experience of food exchange or TV shows or all the above, it does lead to these mixings, but also should lead to critique. Desire is about mixing and critique. I think that's kind of my takeaway. Like you can do both. Desire is certainly about mixing and contact. We got that. But if it's just about that, it will, without critique, it'll lead to commodification typically, and consumption, and so on. And also, critique without desire is just boring. And loses, it becomes an exercise to some extent, and you lose the body, and you lose just the sort of motive behind cultural mixing and so on. So desire and critique go together. I think that's absolutely key here. So I mean, this kind of gets us to the very end, so we don't have to revisit all the rest of the argument, but it's not easy. It's not just because she pointed that. Certainly that we can just stop commodifying and consuming the other. It's that line between appreciation and appropriation is very difficult, ongoing. Maybe it's the thing that requires endless theorizing. It's never stable, but it's the site where a lot of intensity is, and let's say maybe potentially change can happen. So that's pretty powerful on its own. All right, so we'll come back to some of this stuff, I think, because all the rest of the material we're reading asks similar questions. So as we keep that question in mind, we turn to Gloria Anzaldúa, who is this text is from the 1980s. Page we're on here. 186. She is American and Mexican background. Seventh generation Mexican-American family that settled in the Rio Grande in southern Texas. Okay, and we know that, so she's a long inhabitant of that area, but that would have meant that her family started off as in Mexican territory, and then that was fought over by the United States, became American territory. And so she has this sort of, let's say, a dual, like a double consciousness sensibility of Mexican and American. And is going to theorize through that background. Let's take a look on 1986. It says the following. My Spanish is very poor, so here we go. From Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza, 1986. Jose Vasconcelos, Mexican philosopher, envisaged una raza mestiza, un mezcla de razas afines, una raza de color, la prima raza synthesis del globo. He called it a cosmic race, la raza cosmica. A fifth race embracing the four major races of the world, opposite to the theory of the pure Aryan and the policy of racial purity that white America practices. His theory is one of inclusivity. At the confluence of two or more genetic streams with chromosomes constantly crossing over, this mixture of races, rather than resulting in an inferior being, provides hybrid progeny, a mutable, more malleable species with a rich gene pool. From this racial, ideological, cultural, and biological cross-pollination, an alien consciousness is present in the making, a new mestiza consciousness, in consciência mujer, is a consciousness of the borderlands. And then the next page is una lucha de fronteras, a struggle of borders. There's a quote, kind of a poem quote. The ambivalence from the clash of voices results in a mental and emotional states of perplexity. Internal strife results in insecurity and indecisiveness. The mestiza's dual or multiple personality is plagued by cyclic restlessness. Okay, I want to ask you, just from this material we've read here, actually, even before, there's a lot of Spanish here. And notice there's not as many footnotes as you might expect. Usually when you have language that's not English, throughout, generally, this anthology, we get the translation. How come we don't usually get it in this one? Curious about that.
The footnote mentions that, like, at her request, they didn't translate.
Yeah, so what's going on there?
It is dramatic, right? Like, her point is about this intersection of identity, and the language is part of that. That it's written in English and Spanish is part of, like, the expression of that identity.
Okay, good. All right, so all of us who are interested in multiple languages, translation, the intersection of language and cultures, obviously that's at stake here, and we'll do it. But Andula doesn't actually do the translation part. So Sarah, remind me. Okay, yeah. So you're saying it's a demonstration of hybridity.
Yeah.
Okay, but why also specifically not the translation thing? Why not? Why refuse the translation part? Because you would think translation is hybridization. Why actually hold back a little bit from that, the translation part? Just curious, just to concretize it. I don't have any real, or go ahead.
I feel like sometimes when people intentionally write in a different language, it's like there was like intention behind it. She chose to write it in Spanish, and she's like, if you translate it, that removes the intentionality behind it. Good.
Yeah, so it sort of eats the other, if you will. Eats the Spanish, reduces its spiciness to English, the bland language that we also. Okay, all right. Well, Tim, and then Maya, and then Sarah.
Yeah, I think also there's often, especially when the whole discussion is about where the kind of where the self is in our identities.
Yeah.
Like this is something interesting. There's like the crossing over of between identities and between positions.
Yeah.
And sometimes certain positions are favored more than others. And for us, English is favored. It's like by the virtue of the fact that whenever we're reading something, there is a translation in the footnote. It's like, there is that where it could have been a moment of perhaps traversing the liminal space of the border between these two languages, it becomes rather just an exercise in reading more English.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good. So, all right, so far so good. I think this hits a lot on what Bellux and we were just saying. What's the line between appropriation and appreciation? Well, it's interesting. It's by leaving it untranslated or in Spanish, it's kind of refusing a little bit of that appropriation gesture, and because English is an appropriating language, and it's questioning that. Okay, Maya, well.
It was a similar point. I think that having the Spanish in there is a form of resistance.
Yeah.
And it's just representative of the space that she's occupying as a theorist who comes from not a white background.
Yeah. I mean, she has both. So she has English, and she has Spanish background, and so she's going to give us both, but as resistance, not as. I mean, it is double consciousness and it's double language sort of textuality, but not so that they just kind of lose she wants the friction there a little bit by not just not translating, but also not the footnote either. That gives us the translation, kind of sneaks it through. Okay, Sarah, then Jen.
Yeah, well, I think it comes back a bit to that Billy Bell quote again, right? Like sometimes you aren't invited into everything.
Yeah.
And that it seems like that's kind of part of this as well. Like she's talking about an identity that she wants people to understand, but at the same time, maintaining that difference is important. And distance is important as well.
Okay,
you're also not invited into the identity.
Yeah. Okay. So far so good. Other ones, Jen?
It was pretty similar to what people are saying, but I do think it's cool that it's, again, showing what she's arguing at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm. Forming the argument.
Yeah, but I was going to say, opacity is a site of resistance. Basically, what is untranslatable and what is untranslated by her agency, right? She gets to determine this, right? It doesn't all just turn into this bland English. She's holding the space for her culture that way.
Yeah, good. Nicely said. Well, all right, good. Okay. Tina and then Keaton.
You want?
You go first.
Okay. I wanted to ask like I agree with everyone, but her point is not like not making it understandable for our readers, because she, I think, specifically chooses words that have Latin roots.
Yeah.
So basically, as an English reader, we understand
Yeah.
to some part what is
Yeah.
she talking about. Even
Yeah.
the words that we don't have a clear idea,
Yeah.
like mestiza,
Yeah.
she later gives definition like what she means by that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of ironic. We understand it.
Yeah.
Like we are reading a language that we don't have any clear idea
Yeah.
what is it about, but at the same time we know her point. We get her point.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I want to say that, like, we're in the position of the language learner, and we're going to go through that, like, because she's going to not totally leave us out. She's going to kind of slowly give us some of the meanings behind these words, and they're close sometimes to some other words that other people might know. So yeah.
I think Tina is great in interpreting languages. I don't find it that simple. I learned Spanish for a month. That's
Okay.
barely enough. Sometimes maybe like you concentrate. If I read French, sometimes I understand a bit, you know. And then I think this is like an assertion of identity. This is saying we're, Spanish in terms of culture and so on. And also, it's like it's a resistance or refusal of being like consumed or distorted in a way. If you translate everything, it get lost. Lots of things get lost.
Yeah.
And then this is also an invitation for people to learn the language, to understand and appreciate the culture.
To learn some Spanish, and some sort of the Mexican experience of that Spanish. And that, again, I think speaks to this question of resistance and refusing appropriation, but wanting to have connections, it's pretty cool to see this version of it. Okay, well, we should also just try and define what is the new mestiza, this mestiza figure. So we like figures in theory, really, new characters and figures. So this mestiza is what exactly? Some characteristics of the mestiza figure. It is gendered female, mestiza. I don't know enough Spanish to know male gender for that word. Does anybody know it? No.
It would probably be with an O.
Mestizo.
Probably female.
Yeah. Like Latina, Latino, mestiza, mestizo, I would presume, but I've never. But okay, keep going. So, what is mestiza?
It's sort of like this, in between space, between. It's like, what is it? The spiritual and the transfer of the cultural and the spiritual values of one group to another.
Okay, good. Yeah. So, kind of maintaining what we would talk about all today, and it's an example of that. This sort of between place. This certainly another figure for double consciousness. What else is it? She also calls it new consciousness. Keep going though. The thoughts on mestiza.
On the next page, she calls it la mestiza.
Yeah.
She refers to the mestiza as she. She says she's.
Yeah. She's emphasizing the gender there.
Yeah,
a
which
lot.
I think is interesting that she chose to do it as a female figure.
Yeah.
I feel like usually whenever someone talks about the third figure, it's always male.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even like the double consciousness of Du Bois, I think he uses the gender man exclusively. And the question is what is female double consciousness if you're black? And he doesn't really, he kind of has some masculine language in there to imply that's like, how does this? I'll show it to you. If I can find it. So she is well aware of that. She's certainly read her Du Bois, and it's a bit awkward to say the least. Come on, 8, 4, 5. He says, the history of the American Negro is the history of the strip. This is 846. This longing to self-conscious manhood. He just throws it right out there. To merge his double self into a better and truer self. So, what if you're not in that self-conscious manhood lineage? Whoops. There's a lot of other language around that. Like, it's about striving. It's about, like, you know, the effort, the stress, the, you know, like this physical thing that is. And she's trying to get away from that by gendering it female and making it and other kinds of associated female qualities like home working at the home, domestic work. So La Mestiza is a kind of aware of the domestic. Okay, then I'll start to fill it in here. Unless just the next page, 1988. Okay, well, rigidity means death. Only by remaining flexible, she's able to stretch the psyche horizontally and vertically. La Mestiza constantly has to shift out of habitual formations. The new Mestiza copes by developing a tolerance for contradictions, tolerance for ambiguity. She learns to be an Indian to Mexican culture, to be Mexican from an Anglo point of view. She learns to juggle cultures. She has a plural personality, pluralistic mode. Nothing is rejected, nothing abandoned. She can be jarred out of ambivalence by an intense and often painful emotional event. The works, okay, that's kind of like this fulcrum thing. This future will belong to the Mestiza because the future depends on breaking down of paradigms. It depends on the straddling of two or more cultures. Like creating a new mythos, that is the way we perceive reality, the way we see ourselves and the way we behave. La Mestiza creates a new consciousness. The work of Mestiza consciousness to break down subject-object duality. Skip a little more. Answer to the problem between the white race and the color, between males and females, lies in the healing split that originates in the very foundation of our lives, our cultures, our language, our thoughts. So just, I mean, I kind of, it is maybe too obvious, but a few more things about La Mestiza that you want to add? Yeah.
Just one thing that I noticed, it does change gender.
Yeah.
To the mestizo on 1992.
Okay.
I think grammatically it might just be because
that's the section on macho.
Yeah.
Macho.
It's because Enzo Lewis is specifically talking about queer men and
or not. Yeah.
Like the like homosexuality.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The mestizo. I see what you mean. Yeah.
And I was trying to see if there was a point in which that was like introduced, but I couldn't really see it.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I think
it is the section on like machismo.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah. So the macho is not a mestizo.
Yeah.
But the mestizo is someone who is able to sort of be man and woman in a queer sense. It reminds me a lot of everything from our queer theory and even Virginia Woolf. Yeah. So mestiza, other. Go, keep going.
Yeah, well, like a difference between Mestiza and like the other narratives of double consciousness that we've seen is that there's more of an emphasis on creating something new, right? Like there's more of an emphasis on not just being in between, but on like the creation of something new. Yeah, this is a future. Yeah, it's partly undefinable. It's partly cannot be defined because that's the whole point it's not. It has to be creatively made, and so it requires sort of like an empty category aspect to it. And so that's key to it. And in some sense, we don't even know what La Mestiza is because it's always going to like creatively change. Samantha?
Well, thinking about like the ways in which it like kind of transcends like just being like classified.
Yeah.
It just reminds me so much of like the rhizome, like Deleuze and Guattari's rhizome.
Yeah.
Just being like this heterogeneous, like free floating, like multiplicity of identities that like are specifically like refusing to be defined in that specific way.
Yeah. But I will say, I agree with that, except for I do think it's a little bit of also somewhat of a criticism of it, but just saying it's not, I wouldn't say free-floating, but it's sort of like dual national, or it has a sense of place. And, but a double place, or maybe several places, but at least it's not so unplaced that it's lost that sense of location. Whereas, so Deleuze, it might be a little bit too freed from any specific place.
Rooted but not.
Yeah, this is sort of, but it is Deleuzian. Like as you say, like actually grass is rooted. The rhizome is grass. It has to be both rooted and spread. at the same time. So deep down, I do think it does coincide with the Deleuze, but the Deleuze had often been read as like, oh, well, it doesn't care about race anymore. It's just sort of like beyond race, like articulation. But no, your point is that that's not how what the mestiza is. It is place and race, but not stuck in those places. And race is also something you invent as much as a family thing or a genealogy. It's both. Yeah, Vincent.
And I think it's particularly interesting that the mestiza or mestizo is like people who are othered within their own culture as well. Like I think she, on page 191, she talks about specifically about standing up against the machismo culture.
Yeah.
In like the lower paragraph, like, though we understand the root cause of male hatred and fear, the subsequent wounding of women, we do not excuse, we do not condone, we will no longer put up with it. So I think it's particularly, it's not just like the contrast of like an othered as like a racialized person versus white people. It's like very specifically also against like that kind of like masculinist culture in her own culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it is so relevant for today. Like I was just writing, like the New York Times had an article yesterday of this Latino man, 25-ish years old, who is like from New Mexico or something like that, and is driving along in his car, and he's like, you know, 8 years ago I voted for Bernie Sanders, and it was part of like the Democratic Socialist movement. And then when Bernie Sanders lost, I just switched to Trump. I'm like, what? But it's not unusual. Like, weirdly, I get that. It's repeating. I think he wasn't really a democratic socialist, like if you're that fickle, but it is absolutely, and then his justification is that the Democratic Party had lost men. And it made me feel, he didn't use the word macho, but it's exactly what he was describing. It made me feel secondary or something like that. Well, the problem with that position, first of all, is that feminism is not about, like, men cannot affirm themselves, okay? But it means also, you can also affirm women, too. So the fact that he felt diminished, that's not what the Democratic Party was doing. So he bought into this sort of right-wing ideology. But it's because he's voting some sense of his machismo. But Trump played that up. Trump tried to convince people that you will lose it if you vote for this woman, and you will gain it if you vote for this man. Even though at the sort of like other forms of racial, I don't know what I would call it exactly, but sense of like compromise, if that's the right word, or like subjugation, maybe is the right word. Like in some sense, Trump gets a vote of all these mixed race folks, but also by not really validating their racial stories. But basically saying that you're going to vote for me, you can be validated at the macho level, at the, let's say, level of prosperity, level of capitalism, but not at the level really of being like, you know, Mexican American. He thinks, because we know, because he's over and over used stereotypes. They're all rapists and so on. So, and that sort of sexual wildness, the primitive language that we see in bell hooks and so on, still circulates rampantly in that context. So to me, that's what feminism was trying to criticize, and he wasn't ready to hear it, sadly. So I just point out is that this was written yesterday, this text, or tomorrow. It's pretty amazing. Okay, well, so we've covered a decent amount of what this La Mestiza is. It's breaking down subject-object duality, but it's also the sort of collision point between all these contradictory situations, and so that speaks to today. I think today's the collision point of that. But it remains flexible. It remains contradictory. Can hold those together. It can be both future and past. It can also heal that split, though. It's not about letting the trauma just sit there between all these dualisms. It's trying to form a kind of way out of that crisis. As she says later on, like a misinformed people is a subjugated people. So she's not about just sort of leaving people stuck in this kind of antagonistic situation. It is also about growing, literally. So it's interesting that, again, the deluge in the grass. We can't eat grass. Is it then the best plant metaphor for togetherness? Well, the mestiza is the figure of corn culture. So she says on 1989, sort of so corn, indigenous like corn, the mestiza is a product of crossbreeding, designed for preservation under a variety of conditions. Like an ear of corn, a female seed-bearing organ. The mestiza is tenacious, tightly wrapped in the husks of her culture. Like kernels, she clings to the cob with stalks and strong bracers. She holds tight to her shields around the crossroads. So just like we theorize the ship, you could theorize corn. Corn is very important in indigenous culture, Mexican culture, Mexican-American culture, and she's offering some of that. But also just, again, the idea that you can have a sense of sort of agrarian attachment, like so a lot of North American farming is done by underpaid or exploited Mexican and Latin American workers. And so that's part of the story of corn. And it's also the story of the La Mestiza figure. And later on, she says also just that Chicana people, Chicano and Chicana, she said in 1997, have always taken care of growing things and the land. And how they care for seeds, and they plant them in various places, sometimes various places you don't expect things to grow, like car tires or whatever, shoe boxes, cans. Then she says, we water them and hoe them, we harvest them, the vines dry rot or plot under, growth, death, decay, birth, the soil prepared again and again, impregnated, worked on, the constant changing of forms. Renacimientos de la tierra madre, rebirth. Like, of the motherland, but again, Earth often is gendered female, and so on. And so this female planter, care figure, grower, harvester, replanter of dead, things, and that process is the La Mestiza figure. I wanted to ask as a follow-up, so how would someone, I don't know, this is way too staged, but like eating the other be contrasted to the corn, La Mestiza? Is it too obvious? The crisis of eating the other in bell hooks and the spiciness, that language versus the La Mestiza figure. Is there a conversation there? Or are we all too tired? Later. Yeah.
I think I would probably suggest that there's not really I think the metaphor of eating the other in bell hooks is very carnivorous, right? It's carnivorous and cannibalistic, so it's very, even the movie that she talks about with the heart. Yeah. Very much about the consumption of the body, and the metaphor of the corn is really, I think, distinct from that. It's maybe making the body more plant-like, and saying and making that comparison. But there's not a discussion in this when you're talking about the corn of the corn as something that you eat even. Oh no. Well, there's kind of, but it's more like, I think it's more like the corn is something that grows. The whole cycle of the corn. Right? Yeah. So it's not just about a consumption culture. Okay, I feel I agree with that. So we're not just stopping with the eating process as that's the important. It's the whole process. Mm-hmm. I'm going to put that in my notes. The whole process is the corn, and you see that kind of in that poem as well. And so that's maybe how we get away from this consumption cycle. This eating cycle is if we understand our food. And by the way, food is the most Marxist thing we have on a daily basis, I sometimes think, because it's all about understanding who made this, where did it come from. It's also the most ecological thing on a daily basis. But but the Marxist ecology of it all was about saying, where does this come from? The food, the labor, the circulation of it, and that's in this scene of corn and La Mestiza. Yeah,
drink Victory Gin daily. I don't think it's more Marxist than that.
Yeah.
And then the corn also, like, the consumption that Bell Hooks talks about is like
Yeah.
a one and done, or it's something that is like, it eats it and never
Yeah.
returns, but the corn is like indigenous to the land.
Yeah.
So, because she mentioned how it has like, it's a product of crossbreeding designed for preservation under a variety of conditions. So it's kind of like, it's something that will never not be indigenous to the land or be taken
Yeah.
from it.
Yeah.
And even like with the cycle of eating, there's always gonna be more corn.
Yeah, exactly. Even when you eat it, you can make more with it. Yeah. So nicely said. Yeah. This is very smart, like combining of all the tools we've got in our toolbox. Using our metaphor, we're theorizing an object like the ship, but now we're doing corn. We're using race. We're using ecology. We're using marks. We're using close reading. We're using and metaphor, and we're using understanding the difference between eating once and circular practices of eating. We're using our vegetarian skills, by the way, versus our carnivorous skills. And I am a vegetarian, so I am on board with that. I'm not forcing that on anybody, but if you want to theorize corn, this is a good thing.
I
Great.
think maybe something else that I don't really know what it means. I'm just thought of it now, but like, figuring it as like they are the corn, but then also at the end, like they're also the growers of the corn.
Yeah.
So it's like you're the one growing the corn, but also you are the corn.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't know. There's
Yeah,
something.
well, yeah, there's a sort of kinship. So indigenousness that's a key word in indigenous theory, certainly, obviously, in this kind of context too, which is partly indigenous, but the idea that that's part of the family, part of who you are, but also part of your family, part of your, you are corn, you're made out of corn, but you grow it. It's also sort of something you care for outside of you as sort of your kids or something like that. And but you can be in multiple subject positions at once when you're tending the corn and being with the corn and being corn. Yeah, Kelly.
Also, visually, like, corn shows characteristics of, like, different identities, whereas, like, you use the word carnivorous, like, there were races.
Yeah.
Like, one identity only shows one thing, where, like, a mixed thing shows many different colors.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's multiple species of corn, and it is a hybrid thing even today. Like, what we're all eating has been highly, farmed, like genetically modified. But she's not saying that's ruined the purity of corn. She's like, that's what happens, and that's part of the story of corn too. And it's, we don't want GMO, like, commodified corn. It's kind of what we're mostly eating, sadly. But on the other hand, there is a way to crossbreed. Like, even indigenous people were crushing corn. So it is a crossbred, let's say, plant from the get-go. Okay, so good. This is all very, very compelling. So, knowing that we're close to the time here, I think that's good on Ladua. Although I was going to say, describe the method once again. You see poetry, you see different languages, you see philosophy, you see personal, use first-person pronoun, the I. You see mixed citation practices. You see philosophy and science and corn and TV and the devaluation of the peso in 1982, which I had sort of forgotten about. And that's why in this ongoing crisis, which, as she said, I thought that was totally enlightening to me. That before that, a lot of times Mexican people would go to the United States to buy new products, and they could afford that. And then suddenly, when that happened, it was just, you'll make the products cheaply, and we will buy them. It was this one-way flow of capital and labor, and impoverished one side and enriched the other side. And that's obviously a disaster. So I don't really, the economics of it all, I'm sure, are complex, but the reality is pretty stark. So trying to get away from, so anyways, even economics is put into this blend of multiple styles and methods. All right, so that's the amazing Gloria Ansaldúa. We have Anne Spekovich. Always, as you know, if you're on the last of the syllabus, you get short stick. So you only get 5-ish minutes or so, Anne Spekovich, 8 minutes. And that's okay. I think we're all hitting the wall. As my wife's a high school teacher, and as she normally put it, she says, well, her principal told her, said, November is teacher burnout month. It's also student burnout month. It's a phrase I will keep with me every November. So knowing that, N. Cvecovich is an interesting theorist of affectivity, and it's kind of a theme that will come back to us in 2 weeks. Affect theory is specifically on the plate today. But I put this in here. I also wanted to show, this essay just came out like 2 years ago or 1 year ago, so it's very fresh. Reading, 2020's Billy Ray Belcourt as its highlight. So I wanted to show you theory in the now, theory in the present, just so we don't think everything we're reading is 50 or more years old. So I think that's always important. It combines a lot of the things that we have been talking about. It includes some reflections on auto theory and the use of first-person theory. Certainly the sort of longer history of critical race theory. But also form is an issue for her. So sort of a literary theory, English department kind of issues that we've been revisiting. I'll probably just highlight a few things here. I don't know if even in terms of discussion, I don't have great questions here. But it starts off by talking about Claudia Rankine's Citizen. The first sentence says, one way to gauge the current state of affect theory and how it has been informed by questions of race. Look at the popularity of Claudia Rankine's Citizen, American Lyric. It's a great book, but I'm not going to say too much about it. You get some discussion of it here. It was a breakthrough. It did a lot of, it's a multi-genre work. So just like we talked about that in Anzaldúa or in Fanon or in Du Bois, it's all many other examples. And that is on the poetry side, but includes a little bit of theory. So, so we would say things like, similarly with Billy Ray Belcourt and so on, like they're probably more poets and writers, but they throw in the theory. Whereas we might be more on the theory side, we'll throw in a little bit in the writing. Its Citizen came out in 2014, and it really accelerated in its sort of the consciousness and intention, right? Like leading up to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's sort of an iconic text for that movement, up to like Eric Garner, and it was 2016, I think, was killed in 2016, and then almost like in a revisiting of that, George Floyd, sort of both were choked. And and interestingly, both, well, you might say, like, what if you look at that Reagan book, it's really interesting about like all these microaggressions. It's sort of like, what happens if everyone thinks, oh, Obama's there and we're after race, and like we've kind of gotten over race, haven't we, and all that stuff. But yet microaggressions flourish, where it's sort of like these little slights that turn into sort of like scenes of shame and diminishment. Like no one's gonna like call someone a slave like that. We're not doing that. That's that doesn't happen. But one gets treated in sort of like ways which re-evokes that kind of trauma over and over again. So Claudia Rankine highlights that. Cvecovich is picking that up and trying to just talk a little bit about what's going on here with the convergence of affect and race. And she says the following on the next page, 162. Okay, the specificity which Rankine documents the everyday encounters that are the manifestation of systemic racism, especially in middle-class contexts, resists the flattening that can be the result of such a generic diagnostic category. So both race and, I guess, affect are flattened sometimes. Rankine's method of documenting ordinary racisms through the innovation in form that has been called lyric essay opens up new ways to describe systemic racism by drawing attention to its affective life. She uses her skills as a poet to capture moments of disruption or encounter without having to provide character or narrative. These are sketches, scenes, fleeting and ephemeral moments whose serial accumulation produces an archive of feelings. Archive of feelings is a bit of Cvecovich's own terminology. She wrote a book with that title. So anyways, showing that there's like a racial archive of feelings here. In my notes I said I was going to discuss this sense of everyday racism is this. So all right, the big in the title of this essay is called Minor Feelings, and that so minor is a pun on minority as well as smaller feelings. So one may not have this overt encounter with like a total racist white supremacist, although that can happen, no doubt. But one often finds like these eruptions in places that were supposedly safe or like middle class or something like that, or everyday. And this is what this essay is trying to highlight, that minor feeling, okay? And that these sometimes mixed genres are better able to capture those minor feelings than maybe the major genres of like tragedy or, again, sometimes there's a popular genre like the neo-slave narrative, where slavery somehow comes back, either in the present or in the future or in the past. Like characters can go back in time, or you can rewrite the slave narrative in the present and so on. But that's very much not a microaggression. That's a major aggression. But we don't exactly live in that world per se. And what are the forms that fit the present? And maybe this lyric essay, because it is captured moments of disruption, encounter, sketches, fleeting ephemeral moments. But as they accumulate serially, they produce an archive of feelings. So what is the form that fits the affect? What is the and vice versa? This is kind of what this essay is about. I'm skipping a little bit forward. I do kind of have a question, but I'm sort of answering it myself, but I'll get to the question. The question is exactly what is minor feeling? But anyways, I'm half answering it, but half asking it. On 164, she says the following: the intersexual convergence of efforts to document the queer and racialized ordinary and everyday as affect or structure of feeling represents a new turn in affect theory. It also takes the form of a writing project. And she gives other examples like Maggie Nelson, or Sadie Hartman, or Christina Sharp, Fred Moten, Eve Sedgwick, Lauren Berlant, people that some of whom we read. Then she says the following at the bottom of 164 and 165. Although emerging from a range of sources and contexts, the turn to affect in this work has shared a commitment to moving beyond the spectacle of trauma to something more everyday, and to a dialectical relation between positive and negative affects, or critique and reparative strategies. That means that mourning and joy, pessimism and utopia are not distinct. It builds on the legacy of social movement politics, including its failures and disappointments, its affective modes of left melancholy and political depression. And so this evolution is marked by forms of generational and citational transmission, where each generation takes up its precursors and pushes their work forward. So that includes like Jose Munoz and so on. Then her examples are Kathy Barkong and Billy Ray Belcourt. But I just wanted to pause at least one small moment for conversation here and ask you, what is this contemporary theorizing? She's trying to theorize in the very moment that we are all in right now, and saying that minor feelings is going to help us do that. I just wanted to ask us, can we just rehearse that together? Why is it able to do that? What is it tackling specifically about the present? All right, get us started.
I mean, what she's saying is it's providing like a record of actual like cause and effect.
Yeah, good.
Basically, so it's like it allows you to theorize further about like how to address problems like racism, right? By providing a record of the actual effect of day-to-day life.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's attentive to the everyday encounters of this, without trying to sort of fit it into like, okay, this is obviously the accumulation of 500 years of racism. Like, she's not doing that move. She's trying to be like, well, how do we be specific to this every day, in the present, to the causes? Yes, we know those causes may be 500 years old in part, but they're also just immediate. They happen today. So there's a contemporary causality too, and that the word again, minor feelings, is suggesting that, like again, a major theory of racism, if you will, or a strong theory versus sometimes what's called a weak theory, would be just saying again it's a 500-year accumulation. But she doesn't want to do that exactly. She wants to sort of highlight how it can be flexible in the present, these minor feelings and minor slights, and we need to have a theory that is aware of that. It's a little bit new territory, exactly. Anything else we think we want to add to what the minor feeling theory is doing as a sort of theorizing in the moment? Theory is in the very present. Anyone want to add to that? It's very hard to theorize the present. It's much easier to go back 40, 50 years. I give. That's why I put this on there. But it's not easy for us to talk about it even in the present. So.
Yeah, I don't know. It makes me think of two things. One is Sarah Maud and her discussion of when you like walking into a room and you carry things with you, that there's this sort of like trail.
Yeah.
And, like this comes into a lot of like the modern affect theory and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do we deal with like our orientation
Yeah.
in the moment towards things? How do we interact with objects around us?
Yeah.
How do these relate to our body?
Yeah. And on the one hand, we want to understand that trail that we carry with us, but on the other hand, we want to understand that experience in the moment and the ephemeral present experience of it too. And it's very hard for theory to do that. I think we're good at the older stuff. Where it's hard to do it in the now, and you're in the very moment you're in. By making the ephemeralness part of the story, like that, the microaggression disappears almost as it appears. So in Claudia Rankine, there's like a kind of famous scene of this where like it's written in the first person I. Is that Rankine herself? I don't know, but in Los Angeles, the I goes to see the therapist, knocks on the door of the therapist. The therapist opens the door and screams like, "Get out of here!" And like, this is supposed to be healing. It's like you're going there for therapy, not to be traumatized, to remove the trauma. And then, so Rankin, I'm going to assume it's Rankin, but I don't know if that's right. But anyways, Rankin replies by saying, "I'm here for my appointment." And then the woman says, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Right? And of course you're here for the appointment. Come on in. Right? So it's this microaggression, but like it retells the story of everything in that ephemeral moment. Like the white middle class therapist is trying to make it ephemeral, and yet it is a passing thing. It's not like the therapist saying, "Hey, this is a segregated space. You're black. Get out of here." Like forever. Like it's supposed to be papered over in the second. But so the ephemerality becomes part of the story. As if, oh, get over it. I got over it. Come on in. Like that gesture. And that's what this is trying to theorize. And it's very powerful, very, very compelling, very hard to do, to be honest, because because it has to sort of understand that the quick change of it all. And as she says, including the failures, also feeling depressed. Like, okay, here we are. Again, I think we'll do a little bit of, oh, sorry, shit, we're out of time. But I promise you we'll do this in 2 weeks. The question is what are the dominant affects of now, of the present, of your generation? Is it depression? Is it failure? What is the dominant effect of you being in the English department? Wait a second, don't feel depressed, because you also have to be joyful and excited and utopian and so on. But her point is that how do these coexist? The English department and you, and all of us, we are in this position where we are coexisting in radical depression, and yet we still believe in utopian joy. And so she's thinking is that, anyways,
It's a shift.
What's that?
It's a shift. The dominant affect of our
Yeah, it's a shift.
A shift?
Yeah.
Yeah, and where are we going with it? Yeah, is it going to sink? Is it going?
It's a listing.
Yeah, it's a listing shift.